Chained in a pocket of airless black, Ada Monroe cried out until her throat burned, and the echoes died on stone. The dark answered back, the only witness left, to a wife declared faithless. Colton Reed's voice, measured, unyielding, had already passed sentence. What waited for her was not mercy, but time. Then a sound that did not belong to the mine, an impossible echo, slipped through the silence and tugged an Apache warrior toward a brutal truth. What he would uncover would fracture everything. For 28 years, Ada had lived beneath a wide, indifferent sky, her days stitched into the hard fabric of Silver Plume, Colorado. The town was hewn from mountain muscle, a place where fortunes were chased with iron and sweat, where reputations hardened like quartz. From the outside, her life looked solid, respectable, settled. Few men stood as firmly as Colton Reed, her husband. In his 40s, he was spoken of as if he were part of the range itself. He owned the thriving Snake's Tooth mine, a raw mouth in the mountainside that promised silver and security. Their home read like a frontier portrait: prosperity, restraint, quiet devotion, carefully framed. Beneath that polished pride lay cold and absolute. Colton demanded flawlessness. His affection, Ada would come to understand, existed only so long as it reflected his own towering image without blemish. When he believed he had uncovered her trespass, a private betrayal that to him stained his honor beyond repair, something in him went rigid and sharp. He did not rage in public. He did not shout. His justice would be clean hidden, final mirroring the secret sin he believed she carried. The weeks before had been a long withdrawal of warmth, a winter edging in on a spring that never returned. He watched her closely. A subtle shift in his gaze became a verdict she could not yet read. One crisp morning, pine and wood smoke in the air, he approached with a rare glint, almost familiar. He spoke of a new vein of silver found deep within the Snake's Tooth. Promise glittered in his voice. Calm and persuasive, his words braided hope with something discordant. Ada, aching for the man she remembered, dulled by the quiet erosion of her spirit, followed without question. Together they descended the mine's entrance, swallowing daylight in greedy gulps. With every step the air thickened and chilled. Damp earth and old minerals crowded the breath. The clamor of working tunnels fell away, replaced by the rock's hushed murmur. In those depths where light was only a rumor, Colton delivered his judgment. This darkness, he said evenly, was the only proper confidant for an unfaithful wife. The mountain would keep her secret forever. The hammer struck iron. The shackle closed around her wrist. The sound rang like the last chord of a collapsing world. Ada's terror surged, then drowned beneath a crushing certainty. This was not confinement. It was an ending. She screamed until the stone swallowed every plea. She pulled at the chain, iron biting skin muscle, straining against inevitability. The rock did not yield. The final echo of the hammer traveled not only through the tunnel, but through the hollow spaces of her own skull. That sound sealed it, a sentence carried out not by law, but by a husband whose love had curdled into something unrecognizable. Her breath tore and caught each inhale, thin and cold, as if hope itself had thinned to nothing. The dark pressed in absolute heavy, threatening to crush the will to breathe. This was more than the absence of light. It felt alive. Her eyes strained for a spark that never came. In the void, other senses sharpened, blessing and curse entwined. Fear tasted metallic on her tongue. Grit scratched her throat. Cold seeped into bone, promising numbness long before thirst or air would finish their work. Rough stone rasped her back, an unending reminder of where she had been left. The shackles were merciless. Skin tore with every futile tug. Weariness settled deep. More than physical exhaustion, it was the weight of a soul under siege. Panic ebbed into a quieter despair. Guilt coiled tight around her heart. Not for pleasure there had been none, but for a brief, desperate reach toward warmth in a marriage turned glacial. She had sought understanding, a moment of human connection. For that, the price was everything. Colton's pride, she realized with a shudder, unrelated to the cold, was not merely his flaw. It was the God he served, one that demanded sacrifice and accepted nothing less. Her life, her very soul, had been reduced to a sacrifice on a cold, merciless altar. Promises once whispered under the golden sun now echoed as cruel mockeries in the pitch-black depths. The man who once vowed to protect her was now her executioner, intent on burying not just her body, but every trace of her existence in the belly of the mountain. Time lost all meaning. No sun, no shadow, just endless dark and pain. Ada Monroe's wrists bled from the iron shackles that rubbed them raw. Her legs, trembling and weak, barely held her upright. Every muscle screamed for release. Despair slithered in like a snake in the dark, wrapping around her mind, whispering of surrender, to just let go, to slip into the stillness, to stop fighting. The silence tempted her. It offered an end to agony, to guilt, to everything. But beneath the gnawing fear and thirst, another emotion stirred, deeper, older. A visceral shock at what Colton Reed had done. This wasn't justice. It was savagery. Cold-blooded, calculated, dressed in the garb of honor but reeking of betrayal. The man she'd once loved had judged her unworthy of life, worthy only of being forgotten. That truth cracked something wide open in her. The personal wound deepened into something bigger, an affront to her very humanity. She wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. She was fighting not to disappear, to not become a ghost swallowed by rock and silence. This mind might try to erase her, but she would not go quietly. Something sparked within her, not hope, not yet, but a raw primal defiance, a clawing instinct that screamed, breathe, live. Her body was breaking, her mind fraying at the edges, but her spirit refused to bow. Not now, not like this. And just when the dark threatened to snuff out that final ember, something changed. A faint tremor stirred the stone. It wasn't the usual groan of shifting earth. It wasn't imagined. It was real. A whisper of vibration. A sound so faint it barely registered. But it came from above, distant yet undeniably there. It didn't belong. It didn't fit the tomb-like stillness. Ada's breath caught. Her pain didn't fade, but something in her stilled, listening. Far above the scarred earth of the settlers' mining lands, where the wind still howled wild and free through the canyons, Yuma moved like a shadow. 32 winters had honed him into the warrior he was. Apache-born and mountain-bred, Yuma knew the rhythms of this land like the beat of a drum. The white men below dug and tore at the ground, feverish with greed, but he moved with the land fluid, silent, respectful. He was hunting that morning, not for deer or rabbit, but for silence, for signs, for things that didn't belong. And that's when it came. Not the screech of a hawk, not the breath of the wind, no bird, no beast. A sound, thin, fragile, carried by chance on the breeze. A human sound, a cry swallowed by stone rising from the gut of the earth itself. It struck Yuma like a ghost stepping out of memory. This was no ordinary noise. It wasn't natural. It was pain, despair. A voice lost and buried, echoing up through earth and time. It pulled at something older than words, something that stirred in his blood. He changed course without hesitation. Every instinct snapped into focus. He moved like a spirit through the hills, drawn by a thread no eye could see, but every part of him could feel. The sound led him to a forgotten entrance of the Snake's Tooth mine, choked in weeds, timbers rotted with time. The white men used another shaft now, more stable, more profitable, but this one was for secrets. He didn't pause. He didn't pray. He stepped into the dark. The sun vanished behind him, and a heavy silence swallowed the air. Dampness clung to his skin. His eyes, made for open desert, struggled, but his ears, his instincts, they guided him. Soft-footed breath, quiet. Every step downwards sharpened the cry. It was no longer a question. It was a woman, Her voice was faint, broken, but clear now, a whisper of agony, rising from the depths, pleading, not with words, but with the raw ache of the human soul. And Yuma moved faster, toward the sound, toward the soul reaching through stone. Hours later, after threading his way through a maze of blackened tunnels and perilous cuts in the stone, Yuma found her. Ada Monroe lay slumped against the rock, a ghost tethered to the earth by thick iron chains. Her skin had gone pale, her body barely holding to life. Her eyes, blown wide and unfocused, stared into the void, carrying a terror so deep it seemed to have peeled away everything human and left only raw fear behind. Yuma did not need to understand the details of a husband's accusation or the white man's code of honor. He understood suffering. What lay before him was cruelty made visible, an act so warped it broke not only the laws of men, but the order set by the Creator. This was not punishment. It was a violation of life itself. Freeing her was violent, unforgiving work. The iron resisted him, thick and stubborn, sneering at his strength. Each pull tore her already ruined wrists, further skin splitting where the metal had bitten deep. Blood streaked her arms, the wounds angry and raw. With a low grunt and a final surge of effort, the chains gave way, snapping under his focused force. Ada collapsed instantly. Yuma caught her before she struck the ground, her body limp and lifeless in his arms. Without hesitation, he turned and carried her out of the suffocating black toward the distant promise of air and light, her weight, a fragile record of everything she had endured. When they emerged from the mine's gaping mouth, sunlight crashed down on them, blinding and merciless. Fresh air hit Ada's lungs and ripped a convulsive gasp from her chest. She choked, breath ragged and panicked. Her eyes, fevered and unfixed, struggled to understand the figure holding her. Against the glare, Yuma appeared only as a dark, towering shape, an embodiment of the unknown, the wild terror she had been raised to fear. Her cries spilled out, broken and incoherent, filling the open air with the sound of shock and ruin. The desert stretched endlessly before them, vast and unforgiving. But to Ada's shattered mind, it was no refuge, only another nightmare wearing a different face. Yuma understood that fear. To settlers, he was the wilderness given flesh, everything they had tried to erase or dominate. He could give her life, but survival would demand more than healing. It would require her to abandon the world that had condemned her. There were no spoken terms, only necessity. The journey from the mine to his hidden shelter tested them both. Ada hung heavy in his arms, her body ravaged her thoughts, lost in fever. Yuma moved with deliberate care, stepping around sharp stone and thorned brush, choosing paths invisible to untrained eyes. The sun beat down relentlessly, but he read the land, instinctively guiding them from shade to shade toward a sanctuary known only to him. The shelter was a narrow cleft in the rocks, sealed from sight by ancient boulders and stubborn desert growth, a natural stronghold against heat, wind, and intrusion. Inside the cool shadows, Yuma laid her gently onto a bed of dried grasses and soft hides, prepared long before for his own rest. He remained close, silent, and watchful, his dark eyes steady and assessing. He spoke no words, and the wild words were rarely required. With practiced precision, he gathered medicinal plants known to the Yuma people, crushing leaves and roots between smooth stones until their sharp scents filled the air. He spread the salves over Ada's torn wrists, the bitter, earthy paste cooling the inflamed flesh. The relief drew a faint sound from her throat. He brought water drawn from a hidden spring, lifting it carefully to her cracked lips. Ada drifted in and out of awareness, caught between heat and shadow. Her thoughts fractured Colton Reed's cold stare, the hammer's echo, the suffocating dark, the looming silhouette that had pulled her from it. In her delirium, Yuma's strong features blurred into the living shape of the wilderness itself. She whimpered and recoiled, terror flaring fresh and instinctive. Yuma did not retreat. He waited. His patience was unmoving, nearly impersonal, yet his hands stayed gentle. He offered no comfort, no judgment, only what was required to keep her alive. He was not savior or threat. He was simply there. Days slipped past, measured only by the rise and fall of her fever. Slowly the haze thinned, pain dulled. The wounds on her wrists closed, leaving pale scars that would never fade. Thirst eased from agony into ache. As her body mended, her mind began to grasp the impossible truth. She was alive, and the man who had terrified her most had saved her. Fear still lingered, planted deep by years of belief. But now it tangled with something unfamiliar: gratitude. One afternoon, as desert light softened into orange and violet, Ada's eyes finally met Yuma's without panic. The animal terror was gone, replaced by cautious awareness. He sat across from her, relaxed yet alert, a quiet guardian. Without ceremony, he held out a strip of dried venison. Ada hesitated, then took it, her fingers trembling as she ate. It started as a simple act, a mundane exchange, but something shifted in that moment. It was the first time the gap between their two worlds had been bridged, a quiet recognition of shared humanity. Ada Monroe watched him, really watched him for the first time. She saw it then, the quiet strength in his every movement, the calm wisdom in his gaze, the respect he had for the land around them. What she had once mistaken for indifference was in truth a quiet stoicism. He had learned to survive in a harsh world by staying focused, not allowing anything to distract him. Hesitant, Ada asked her first questions, her voice rough and unused. He answered with gestures, soft growls, and the occasional word in a language she could barely understand. He spoke of the mountains, the animals, and the teachings of his people, his words like whispers that brushed across her understanding. One day, as she watched him prepare a fire, something so simple yet so primal, she saw him light it with 2 sticks, an ancient skill that seemed lost in her world. She had grown up with matches and kindling, where fire was just a convenience. But this fire, his fire, was different. It wasn't born of convenience, but of patience, of understanding, a connection to the earth and the elements. He saw her watching, and without a word, handed her the sticks. Ada hesitated, but took them. Her first attempts were clumsy, yielding only wisps of smoke. Yet he didn't laugh, didn't scold. He simply showed her again, his hands guiding hers, his movements measured and precise. There was something deep inside her that refused to quit. Her stubbornness sparked. With each try, her hands became more confident, more practiced, until at last a spark took. A small flame flickered to life, weak at first but real. She had made fire. In that moment, something shifted in her. It wasn't just the fire. It was a spark of self-reliance, a tiny victory over the helplessness she had felt. A skill she had once taken for granted now symbolized her growing strength and adaptability in this strange new world. Just as she began to feel a fragile sense of routine, a new shadow crept across their refuge. The air, usually so clear now, carried a faint, unsettling smell. Wood smoke. But not from their small fire. No, this came from somewhere else, a much larger, wilder source. Yuma immediately tensed. He stood, his eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, a dark plume of smoke rose into the sky, disrupting the pristine blue. It wasn't just a campfire, it was a sign. Someone or something was looking for something or someone. His jaw tightened. The peace, fragile as it was, had shattered. The plume of smoke, dark and unnatural against the clear sky, was a direct interruption to the peace Ada had begun to feel. Yuma's eyes hardened, his body tightening like a bowstring pulled taut. He didn't need to speak, his stillness, his gaze said everything. They were no longer safe. Ada too felt a chill in her chest, a familiar fear returning. The outside world, full of dangers, and the memories of Colton Reed's cruelty, was drawing near. The days that followed were filled with a thick, silent tension. Yuma grew even more vigilant, slipping into shadows, moving like the wind. He would leave at dawn, always returning with news conveyed through gestures and words. Ada was slowly starting to understand. The smoke was no accident. It was a signal, a call one understood by those searching. Yuma spoke of riders and tracking of the outside world's active search. Ada knew deep in her gut that she was the one they were after. Her fire-starting lessons, once a quiet achievement, had now become a necessity for survival. Every flicker of flame had to be hidden, always beneath a rock or sheltered under an overhang away from prying eyes. She learned to recognize the warning calls of birds, the subtle movements of the leaves, and how to listen for the heavy footfalls of an approaching human. Her fear, once paralyzing, transformed into a sharp edge, honed and focused. No longer just a passive victim, Ada had become an active participant in her own survival. Yuma, ever the stoic teacher, showed her how to move silently, how to blend into the shadows, how to read the land. He taught her the difference between the harmless rustle of a rabbit and the purposeful step of a human foot. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged peaks painting the sky with fiery reds and oranges, the silence was shattered. A faint but unmistakable sound reached them, the whinny of a horse, closer than it had ever been, the distant hum of voices. Yuma froze his hand instinctively, going to the knife at his waist. His eyes met Ada's. A silent command passed between them, absolute stillness, absolute silence. Yuma moved with liquid grace, disappearing into the shadows of the rocks, merging with the stone like a part of it. Ada's heart pounded in her chest. Her breath held tight as she pressed herself to the cold ground. The voices grew louder, closer, echoing off the canyon walls. The voices of two men cut through the silence. Their tone was rough words lost in the wind, but their purpose was clear. Then came a low chuckle, a sound so near it made Ada's blood run cold. One of the men had found a trail, a broken twig, a disturbed stone, a small sign left behind by Yuma in his careful movements. The second voice, gruff and impatient, warned of the dangers ahead. He muttered about wild Indians and lost women, the weight of the words thick in the air. These men weren't just passing through, they were on a hunt, and their target was unmistakable. Suddenly a shadow loomed over the entrance of their shelter. A figure dark and large stood framed against the fading light. He peered into the gloom. Ada held her breath, eyes squeezed shut, bracing for the worst. But after a moment, the figure grunted disappointment, heavy in his voice, and moved on. His footsteps faded into the distance. The weight of tension lifted a relief so sudden it nearly buckled Ada's legs. She stayed still, listening until the sounds of horses and men were nothing but a whisper on the wind. Yuma emerged from the shadows, his face grim. His voice, rarely heard, filled the air with an urgent tone. He spoke in his native language, his gestures painting a clear picture of a new immediate threat. The men, he explained, weren't simple trackers. They were scouts for something much larger, a posse sent specifically by Colton Reed to find his lost wife. Ada's heart sank. Colton Reed had staged a far more elaborate ruse than she had ever known. He had posed as the grieving husband while secretly sending men to silence any loose ends. The revelation struck like a fresh blow. Her husband wasn't just cruel, he was cunning, relentless, and determined to demand her vanish. Yuma's gaze shifted to the setting sun, his expression unreadable. He made quick, sharp gestures. The shelter, once a refuge, was no longer safe. They had to leave quickly before the larger party arrived. But this time the retreat wouldn't be quiet. It would be a diversion, a bold move to ensure their escape. Yuma, who had once only saved her life, was now preparing her for battle. A fight against a man whose cruelty stretched far beyond the mine's dark walls. Ada, heart pounding with terror and fierce resolve, realized she was no longer a passive survivor. She was now a fugitive, and her true struggle had only just begun. That night, after the scouts had passed, Yuma led her through the desert with urgency that betrayed his usual stoicism. There was no time for detailed plans, only instinct and the raw drive to survive. Ada no longer. The helpless burden felt clarity settle within her. The safety she had imagined was gone. Josiah's reach extended much farther than Silver Plume. She wasn't just running from a man anymore. She was escaping a system, a twisted mockery of justice, designed to keep his carefully crafted facade intact. Yuma guided her deeper into the labyrinth of canyons, choosing paths that barely seemed passable. Each step was deliberate, his eyes scanning the land as if it were an old friend. He taught her to read the desert at night, how the moonlight twisted shadows, how sound traveled across the open land. Her movements grew quieter, each step calculated to leave no trace. The desert, cold and sharp, became both their enemy and their ally. The scent of sagebrush and the distant promise of storms were constant reminders of the wild world they now occupied. As days stretched into weeks, an unspoken bond grew between them, forged not by words but by shared struggle and survival. Yuma pushed her limits physically, mentally, but always with purpose, never with cruelty. He taught her how to find water in the driest lands, how to distinguish between safe and poisonous plants, how to hunt and set traps with patience. Ada's hands, once soft and delicate, grew tough and calloused. Her mind, once clouded with fear and guilt, sharpened into focused clarity, fixating only on the task that would keep her alive. They spoke little. Their communication was an intricate mix of gestures, shared glances, and the few Apache words Ada slowly began to understand. She learned the word Azza, meaning woman, a word Yuma used with quiet respect. He learned her name, Ada, and how it held softness, despite the strength she had discovered within herself. As they journeyed across the silent expanse, their stories unfolded in subtle ways. Ada shared her tale of marriage, of the suffocating expectations, the quiet despair that led her to rebellion. Yuma listened, his dark eyes steady and unwavering, offering no judgment, only the vast silence of the desert. He told her of his people, of ancient wisdom, of the deep connection they had with the land. His words spoke of balance, respect, and harmony with all living things. One evening, by a small hidden fire, Yuma looked at her with a gaze so intense it pierced through the flickering shadows. Ada saw him not just the man who had saved her, but as something more. The quiet strength, the dignity etched in his face, and the sorrow buried deep behind his calm exterior. In that instant, Ada Monroe understood that Yuma's life was one of constant watchfulness, a quiet rebellion against the encroaching world of the white man. She felt the weight of his sacrifice, choosing to help her, a woman from a world completely foreign to his own. A stillness settled between them, a delicate peace forged in the heat of their shared struggle. The wild landscape, once a terrifying void, slowly began to show its hidden beauty, revealing its harsh yet essential lessons. Ada began to see the desert differently, the way the lone cactus stood strong against the dry winds, how the vast night sky stretched endlessly above them, offering a kind of solace. She found comfort in their nomadic life, a stark contrast to the suffocating restrictions of Silver Plume. The chains of guilt that had once weighed heavily on her heart started to loosen, replaced by a quiet strength, a growing sense of forgiveness toward herself. She wasn't absolved by Yuma. Absolution was never his to give, but by the unrelenting journey through the wilderness, a journey that demanded everything from her, and in return purified her. It was in a rare moment of shared vulnerability, as they watched a solitary eagle soar overhead, that Yuma spoke of his own past, not of battles or heroic feats, but of quiet tragedy, of shared loss. His eyes were fixed on the distant horizon as he spoke in a low, almost sorrowful voice about how a similar pursuit by white settlers had torn apart his own family. He spoke of a young cousin, a girl whose laughter had once sounded like the sweet chime of bells, lost forever in the desert chaos during that flight. His words were few, but the sorrow in his voice spoke volumes, an ancient wound that had never healed. Ada, listening closely, felt a sudden chilling resonance with her own experience. The white men, in their pursuit of enemies, real or imagined, had shown no mercy, no distinction between men, women, or children. The act of tracking, of relentless pursuit, wasn't just about Ada's past. It was a painful echo of Yuma's own history. It was a shared tale of loss, of displacement, of a world that encroached with a brutal disregard for life. In that moment, Ada understood the deeper connection between them. Their destinies were intertwined not by chance, but by the merciless threads of history, by a common enemy who valued power and conquest over the lives of others. Just as that realization settled in her chest, a sharp, eerie cry of a coyote pierced the stillness. It was a sound full of wildness, but beneath it, Ada heard something else, something metallic and sharp, the unmistakable crack of a rifle shot in the distance. Yuma's head jerked up, his eyes scanning the horizon. The quiet between them, the fragile bond they had forged, shattered in an instant. The sound was too close, too deliberate to be a random shot fired by a hunter. It was a clear message, a declaration of pursuit, a chilling reminder that the world they had tried to outrun had finally caught up to them. That distant rifle shot, sharp as a knife's edge, cut through the fragile threads of peace they had begun to weave. Yuma's face hardened into a mask of cold determination. He sprang to his feet, his gaze sweeping the land with a predator's precision, missing nothing. The coyote's cry, once a mournful sound of the wild, now felt like a warning, a cry of impending danger. The threat had returned, relentless, unmistakable. No words were needed. The language of danger was universal. Without hesitation, Yuma gestured to the north, where rugged terrain lay ahead, a natural fortress to shield them from pursuit. Ada, her heart pounding instinctively, grabbed their meager supplies. Her hands, once trembling with fear, now moved with steady purpose. The terror that had once paralyzed her now sharpened her focus, transforming into an unwavering determination to survive. The wilderness, once an alien and terrifying force, had become her reluctant ally. Its harshness had become her shield, her protection against the cruelty of men. They moved with urgency, traversing rocky ravines, climbing steep slopes, their bodies driven by adrenaline and the primal need to escape. The rifle shots, once sporadic, grew more frequent, the echoes bouncing off the canyon walls like a symphony of pursuit. They were being hunted systematically, relentlessly. Yuma, with his intimate knowledge of the land, led them through narrow passages and up treacherous slopes, always seeking higher ground, always looking for the vantage point. He used the terrain to his advantage, laying false trails, disturbing rocks, to mislead their pursuers. Ada, following closely, learned to read his subtle cues, a flick of his hand, a slight shift in his posture, a glance at the ground. Hours later, as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks casting the western sky in hues of blood orange and violet, they reached a high plateau. The land stretched wide before them, rock and scrub, with only limited cover. Down below in the fading light, Ada could make out the figures of riders. 4 of them, their horses kicking up plumes of dust into the still evening air. Their forms were silhouetted against the setting sun, their movements purposeful, grim. Ada's breath caught in her throat. She recognized one of them, the broad shoulders, the commanding presence even from this distance. It was Colton Reed. The realization hit her like a wave of cold dread. He hadn't just sent men after her. He had come himself, determined to see his terrible vengeance through to the end. The confrontation was inevitable. Yuma, reading the terrain, quickly moved up behind a cluster of boulders. It was the only protection they had from direct fire. Yuma knew these men well, their tactics, their relentless pursuit. He had faced them before, and so had generations of his people. His voice was low, steady, as he spoke to Ada Monroe, explaining their precarious situation with rare clarity. He showed her how to handle the small pistol he carried, a relic from past encounters, and instructed her on how to load it, how to aim. Her hands shook as she took the weapon, its cold weight a stark reminder of the deadly game they now played. As the Reed outfit drew closer, their shouts echoing across the plateau, Yuma braced himself for the fight. Outnumbered and alone, but armed with deep knowledge of the land and a fierce will to protect. Yuma had come to her aid not out of love, but from a profound sense of justice and an instinctual rejection of the cruelty he had witnessed. His honor, his very purpose, was now bound to Ada's survival. The first shots rang out, echoing like thunder. kicking up dust around their small shelter. Yuma returned fire with calm precision, aiming not to kill, but to incapacitate, to make them retreat. Ada's heart raced, her breath catching in her chest. The terror threatened to take over, but she fired once. Her shot was wild, ineffective, a mere flicker in the chaos. Then a chilling realization struck her. Amid the shouting of the Reed outfit, there was a voice she knew, a voice that had once been a source of comfort. It was Silas Dent, Colton Reed's foreman, the man who had once shown her sympathy and kindness, a man she had thought of as a friend. But now his voice, cold and sharp, betrayed his role as an accomplice. He wasn't just an ally of Reed, he was the one leading the hunt, using his knowledge of the land and his intimate understanding of Colton Reed's ruthlessness. This wasn't just pursuit, it was betrayal, layered with betrayal. The wound ran deeper than she'd realized. She had trusted this man. As the Reed outfit closed in, tightening the noose, Yuma looked at Ada, his eyes speaking a desperate, clear message. There was no time left. Yuma moved swiftly, his actions decisive. He drew her close, pressing the pistol firmly into her hand. His words were short, rough with urgency. "Go west, don't look back, live." With a sudden, powerful shove, he sent her toward a narrow crevice in the rocks, a hidden escape route that would lead her down a treacherous, nearly vertical slope away from the battle. As Ada Monroe stumbled into the darkness, she heard the renewed shouts and the deafening barrage of gunfire. She knew with aching certainty that Yuma was facing Colton Reed's wrath alone. Alone. The noise of the gunfire echoed down the crevice, a horrifying soundtrack to Ada's desperate descent. Every rock that slipped, every jarring impact against her body reminded her of Yuma's sacrifice. She couldn't look back. The image of him standing firm against impossible odds burned into her memory. His final command, "Go west, don't look back, live," spurred her forward, a primal need that drowned out the pain and grief. She moved through the night, a ghost against the endless land. The moon, a cold, indifferent witness, cast long shadows that danced with her own fear. Her mind, once consumed by the struggle for survival, now wrestled with the weight of Yuma's sacrifice. Was he alive? Had his sacrifice been in vain? The questions tore at her, threatening to pull her into despair. But the lessons Yuma had taught her, the wisdom of the land, pushed her forward. She clung to his teachings, how to move with the land, how to survive. She remembered the silent movements, the instinct to seek cover, to follow the faint whispers of the wind. Days blurred into weeks as she crossed the harsh terrain, each step driven by a fierce need to survive. Ada scavenged for what she could find. Her stomach ached with hunger, but her will kept her going. She found meager sources of water, rationing each precious drop as Yuma had taught her. Her body, once fragile and soft, had become toughened by hardship, her spirit hardened by the betrayal and loss. The pistol, a cold, heavy presence in her hand, became a symbol of her resolve. One day, under the merciless sun, she saw him, a lone rider, silhouetted against the horizon. His figure loomed above the shimmering heat haze. It was Silas Dent, unmistakable with his distinctive hat and the way he carried himself. He wasn't pursuing her with the wild urgency of a vengeful husband, but with the slow, methodical persistence of a tracker. He wasn't leading her toward capture. He was guiding her intentionally, keeping her within a certain radius. The realization of his betrayal, his role as a manipulator in Colton Reed's cruel game, became even more unsettling. Silas Dent wasn't just an enforcer. He was the puppeteer. He was guiding her, leading her towards something. What was it? Ada's mind raced, sifting through every conversation, every subtle shift in their interactions. He had always been the quiet observer, the first to know about new veins in the mine, the first to sense changes in the political winds of Silver Plume. Then it hit her. He had once mentioned a forgotten Apache trail that led through a narrow canyon, a trail he had dismissed as too wild for settlers, too dangerous. Now Ada knew it had always been part of Silas Dent's plan. A plan began to form in Ada Monroe's mind, desperate and daring, a fusion of her memories and the lessons Yuma had taught her. She would turn the land that had once threatened to swallow her whole into her weapon. She subtly shifted her course, heading toward the hidden canyon Silas Dent had once mentioned, a place he probably thought was too far-fetched for her to find, too dangerous to follow. She used the lessons she'd learned in stealth, deliberately leaving just enough sign to make it seem like she was struggling, disoriented, yet still pushing forward, keeping up the illusion of a panicked, desperate flight. As she entered the narrow, winding canyon, its sheer walls rising like silent sentinels, the air grew cooler, the weight of the earth pressing down on her. The canyon, once an intimidating trap, now seemed a place of refuge where sound echoed and shadows played tricks on the eye. She knew Silas Dent would follow, certain that he had her cornered. The sound of his horse's hooves grew steadily louder, the heavy rhythm echoing off the canyon walls. She found a spot, a small alcove high above the path, hidden from view, yet offering a perfect vantage point, where she could see the sharp bend ahead. Her heart pounded in her chest as she weighted the cold steel of the pistol, heavy in her hand. Then Silas appeared, his horse moving cautiously through the treacherous path. His eyes were sharp, scanning the canyon walls, searching for her. His frown deepened, suspicion creeping into his mind. The trail seemed too neat, too deliberate. As he reached the sharp bend, the narrowest part of the canyon, Ada raised the pistol. Her shot was true, not aimed at him, but at a loose rock formation high above his head. A collection of boulders, once pointed out by Yuma as unstable, now served as her defense. The shot cracked through the canyon, its echo reverberating off the walls. The rocks groaned, and then like a thunderclap they tumbled down, cascading toward the path below. Silas reacted, instantly pulling his horse back, rearing it in panic, just barely avoiding the falling rocks. He let out a shout, not of pain, but of startled frustration and grudging admiration. His gaze shot up, meeting Ada's eyes across the canyon. A glimmer of something unreadable flickered in his expression. He understood. The frightened woman he once knew was gone. This was a survivor, a woman who had been shaped by the very cruelty he'd witnessed. She was clever and she was strong. Silas didn't raise his rifle. Instead, with a curt nod, a silent acknowledgement of her unexpected cunning, he turned his horse round and rode back the way he had come. He left her there in the and the quiet, echoing canyon. The pursuit was over for him, at least. The chase had ended, not through brute strength, but through wit, through the quiet wisdom that had been nurtured in the wilderness. Ada stood alone, watching him disappear into the distance. The immediate danger had passed. But as the silence settled in, a chill crept into her chest. Silas was gone, but Colton Reed remained. He was the spider in his web, his manipulations still lingering, a darker, more insidious threat lying in wait. The true architect of her suffering, the one who had condemned her to the shadows, was still out there, his vengeance incomplete. The sound of Silas's retreating horse faded, leaving only the profound silence of the canyon, with Ada standing alone, the weight of the pistol still heavy in her hand. The immediate threat had receded, but the silence was not one of peace. It was a silence of transition, a silence that marked the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. She had survived not through sheer strength, but through a cunning honed in the crucible of despair and the quiet teachings of a warrior long gone. The canyon, once a trap, had become her stage, a place where she defied the expectations of her pursuers, and in doing so reshaped herself. She continued her journey west, guided by the sun and the raw instinct for survival. Each step carried her farther from Silver Plume, from Colton Reed's chilling vengeance, and from the ghosts of her past. The wilderness, once a terrifying unknown, had become her classroom and her sanctuary. She learned to live by its rhythms, to respect its power, and to draw strength from its unforgiving beauty. The scars on her wrists, pale white against her sun-kissed skin, remained a constant reminder of her ordeal, but they no longer symbolized shame. They were emblems of survival, reminders of a resilience she had once thought impossible. Years passed, the landscape shifting into a tapestry of hardship, quiet victories, and a deepening connection to the untamed world. Ada never returned to the life she had known. Instead, she carved out a solitary existence on the fringes of civilization. Sometimes she traded small, intricate crafts she made from natural materials. Other times she worked anonymously in remote frontier towns. Always moving, always listening. She had learned to read the subtle nuances of human nature, discerning true kindness from hollow pretense. Her heart, once fragile and cracked, had softened into something more supple, capable of great empathy, but fiercely guarded. The memory of Yuma remained with her, a quiet presence in her heart. She would pause atop a ridge now and then, staring out over the land, wondering about his fate. Had he survived the confrontation with Colton Reed's men? Was his sacrifice ever fully realized? The questions lingered, a bittersweet ache in her soul. She honored him in her own way by living with the same quiet dignity, the same profound respect for the land that he had shown her. She had found not only her freedom, but her very essence in the lessons he had taught. It was a decade after Ada Monroe had escaped in a bustling frontier town far out west, when she overheard a conversation that would forever change how she viewed her journey. She was tending to a small stall selling hand-woven baskets when the voices of two weathered prospectors caught her attention. The name they spoke, Silver Plume, struck her like a forgotten echo from a life she had buried long ago, and she froze. They were talking about Colton Reed, his great wealth, and the power he still held in the region. But then one of the men, his voice low with grim satisfaction, brought up Silas Dent. The prospector spoke of the foreman's mysterious disappearance just after Colton Reed's wife had supposedly vanished. There were whispers, he said, that Silas Dent had found religion and left town, though the explanation was vague, as if it didn't quite add up. The other prospector snorted in disbelief and revealed the true twist of the tale. Silas Dent, he said, had not disappeared at all. In fact, he'd returned to the outskirts of Silver Plume years later, but not as the foreman for Colton Reed. No, Silas Dent had become a reclusive figure quietly setting up a small medical clinic for the local Apache communities. He had become a healer, offering comfort and care where once he had been part of the very system that oppressed them. The prospector marveled at this change, noting how Silas Dent spoke often of an unforgettable encounter in the desert, one that had shifted his entire perspective on life. This man who had once relentlessly hunted her down had been touched by something profound. It wasn't weakness, as Ada Monroe had feared, but a conscious decision, a turning point in his own life. He had been torn between two forces, Colton Reed's ruthless pride and his own innate sense of justice. And in that moment, Ada Monroe finally understood the silent wisdom that Yuma had imparted to her. Yuma hadn't just saved her life. In his defiance, in his willingness to sacrifice for someone who wasn't his own, he had unwittingly planted a seed of redemption in the heart of Silas Dent, her pursuer. Through his quiet moral strength, Yuma had not only saved her, but had also shown Silas Dent a different path, one built on compassion instead of conquest. Her entire journey, once just a desperate escape, now revealed itself as something much deeper, an odyssey that wove together the fates of many. Ada Monroe hadn't just survived. She had become a catalyst for change, creating ripples of transformation in the unforgiving landscape of the Old West. The weight of guilt and fear had long fallen away. What remained was a profound understanding that even in the darkest corners of human cruelty, there was room for grace, for a quiet blossoming of kindness. The desert, vast, silent, and merciless, had been the crucible in which Ada Monroe's spirit had been forged. It was where Yuma's noble sacrifice had resonated far beyond one act, and where the echoes of her screams had ultimately transformed into a powerful anthem of redemption. For even in the unforgiving wilderness beneath an indifferent sky, the human heart, when confronted with both brutality and boundless compassion, always held the power to choose to heal and to find its own way home. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us where you're watching from. What corner of the world are you tuning in from? Leave a comment, and to ensure you don't miss the next adventure, subscribe to the channel. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.